Hello, everybody. My name is Ross Romero, and thank you for joining today's conversation, Amplify with Silicon Slopes. I have the chance to introduce today's panel, and we're going to be having a conversation about issues that are affecting Utah's diverse communities. I'd first like to introduce Jeanette Williams. She is the president of the Salt Lake City chapter of the NAACP. And so she'll introduce herself and also give a little bit of background about what she's been working on. But let me just finish out the introductions. Samantha Eldridge is an Indigenous policy consultant, obviously engaged in issues affecting and involving Utah's Native American community. We'll also hear from Max Chang. He's with American Management Corporation and is the COO, has been very involved in community discussions, and we'll have a chance to hear from him. And then finally, I'll give you some reflections and comments from the Utah Latino community. So maybe with that, Jeanette, if you'd introduce yourself, and again, share with the audience a little bit about who you are, where you grew up, what you do professionally, and then the issues you've been working on here in Utah.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeanette Williams, and thank you so much for having me participate today. I moved to Utah from Idaho 32 years ago, and I've been heavily involved in the community since I was here and before I moved here. I was born and raised in Oklahoma, and I do have a master's degree, and I have one child here that lives here, and then several stepchildren as well as grandchildren. And so I keep extremely busy because as president of the NAACP, civil rights organization, we're always have different issues coming about. So that's just a little bit, on my personal side. And then I don't know if you want me to get into more some of the NAACP things now or wait until
Please.
everybody introduce themselves. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Jeanette. I think it's helpful to explain a little bit about what you've been doing in the community.
Exactly. I have been very involved in the community for many, many years, previously working with former legislators, Senator Pete Suazo, before he was, had his accident, and then Dwayne Bardo and others in the community, and very active and working and passing the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. holiday from Human Rights Day. So that was a huge achievement on that one. Others, of course, had worked before I moved here, and it was Human Rights Day. I've been working with the Salt Lake Education Foundation and other different community groups within Utah, but those things have been extremely busy for us. On our NAACP level, we do have a lot of different committees that we work with. One is being our economic development, our education, our legal redress, our criminal reform, and then we have been working with law enforcement in a lot of areas too. Some of the things that we have worked with, even with the college students, we work to raise funds for scholarships, and we donate 100% of the funds to students going to college here within our state of Utah. So that's been a very good effort on our behalf to do outreach and to keep our young folks involved, as well as our boys and girls clubs that we work with. So it's a huge area, having our college chapters and working with young folks as well here in our state of Utah.
Thank you. Thank you. Very helpful. Samantha, will you introduce yourself?
Yes. Good afternoon. My name is Samantha Eldridge. I am a member of the Navajo Nation. I am originally from New Mexico, but grew up mostly in Utah and consider both places my home. I received a bachelor in sociology, master's in public administration, and I am currently pursuing a PhD in political science from the University of Utah. My research examines the historical and institutional structures that create inequitable policies and practices that impede the success of Native American communities, especially matters of public administration, representation, and governance. I am an Indigenous policy consultant. I have experience based out in Washington, D.C. as a policy analyst and senior liaison for American Indian Alaska Native Outreach. And most recently, I was on executive staff for the Office of the President and Vice President for the Navajo Nation as a policy advisor, overseeing education initiatives and serving as a liaison to the state of Utah. I'm going to jump right in and say that one of our biggest challenges is how to amplify Native voices while we fight invisibility, false narratives, and stereotypes of Native Americans. In the schools and communities that I have visited, what I've seen the most needed is education, just education on Native issues in general. According to an Illuminati 2018 report, nearly 80% of Americans know little to nothing about American Indians. More alarming is a significant percentage of Americans are not sure we exist anymore. 72% of Americans rarely or never encounter information about our community in their daily lives, and nearly 90% of schools in the US do not teach about Native Americans past the 1900s, and our representation in media and film is less than 0.04%. So when people see me, they don't see me, but rather some idea of what I am. This means we don't exist. Invisibility is our modern form of racism against Native Americans. This has real consequences when we are left out of key policies that affect our lives. It's critical to ensure we have Native representation, but that we are also amplifying Native voices and hear stories from and about Native communities. So thank you for having me here today. This is also what is needed within the tech community. When researching diversity reports, Native representation in the workforce is a small fraction of a percentage in all of the tech companies. We are often lumped into the other category, or even worse, left out altogether. Even though our numbers may be small, we want to be represented in your diversity data. This also includes an intentional approach to hire Native Americans, not only on staff, but in leadership positions. So when you talk about what you're doing to support marginalized groups in the industry, we also want to hear about what you're doing for Native Americans. Research our issues, find ways to address the unique challenges we face, and how we can work together to find solutions. One of the biggest barriers in our community is the digital divide between tribal nations and the rest of the United States. This is where I see this forum having a role within our community as far as addressing our obstacle to high-speed internet access on tribal lanes and lack of infrastructure. So I think that's a great starting point to start the discussion. I also want to end by saying that there are 574 tribal nations, all with unique languages, culture, traditions, and we all have varying challenges. I am not an expert, but can only share my experience working in the community. There are also a number of challenges that we face that limits our success. Currently, we're dealing with COVID-19. We have 6,990 positive cases and 335 deaths on the Navajo Nation. Along with the current political climate, Native Americans are killed in police counters at a higher rate than any other racial or ethnic group. We have one of the highest incarceration rates. Here in Utah, Salt Lake City is one of the top 10 cities in the US to hold one of the highest cases of sexual assault and domestic violence towards Native women. We have a lot of work to do to bring more awareness to our issues and challenges. This is one reason we have to look at the whole picture when looking at our community. So from a multidisciplinary and intersectional approach, which we can provide long-term and sustainable solutions. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion and what questions you have.
Thank you very much. Very helpful. Max?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Max Chang. I'm really more like a community activist, art activist. I am with the CEO of American Estate Management, but I was born and raised here in Utah, and my father was probably one of the first, if not the first, immigrants from Taiwan to Utah. And although we don't have it, you know, documented for sure, we do believe that I'm probably the first, or at least within the first three Taiwanese Americans born in Utah. And I was born and raised, and I love this state, but also growing up here during the 60s and 70s, you know, I was one of the very few Asians in this community. And so we talk about a lot of things about how we get a lot of comments, the Asian American community, about go back to where you come from, where are you from originally? So from past active to passive racism. So let me kind of go back to something that was said over the weekend, Kung Flu. Kung Flu. And it seems like maybe a joke, some humor about the coronavirus situation, but it is a repeated action over the years of what has been addressed for Asian Americans. And as a child, I was growing up here in 7th grade, a part of Utah history, we learned about the Transcontinental Railroad, and last year we celebrated the 150th anniversary of that. But when we learned that in 7th grade, very little mention was made of the Chinese railroad workers, even though they comprised of 90% of the Central Pacific Railroad. And so at that age of 12, I said I would not go to the Golden Spike National Historical Park unless something had changed. And 2 years ago, Governor Herbert appointed me to the Spike 150 Foundation. And I took it upon myself to bring the story of the Chinese railroad workers to the schools. And why is that important? I think it was Samantha talked about this, that the history of different groups are not included in the schools. And people are asking, why? Why are you talking about it? Are you trying to change history? I said, no, we are expanding the lens of history. We're trying to see a more of a panoramic view to understand how this country was built by multiple groups of people. And during this process, we see that the Chinese, Leland Stanford wrote to President Johnson, how the Chinese, and this was in 1865, the Chinese were incredible. Without them, we would not have been able to build this railroad. But yet in 1882, when he was a senator, he advocated for the Chinese Exclusion Act, saying that they're an inferior race, that they will not assimilate, they will not be, they're not Christian. And so for the first time in American history, the United States passed a exclusion law barring immigration of a particular race. And that was not repealed until 1943, when they had a quota, they increased quota to about 150 a year from the whole continent of Asia. And it really was not changed until the 1964 Immigration Act, 1965 Immigration Act, excuse me. So that is one thing, because what happened to the Chinese, even though they built the railroad, there was an economic depression afterwards, and the Chinese became scapegoat. And this is what I'm worried about, is history repeating itself. Let's look at 1982. For example, June 19th is a very important day in American history of Juneteenth, but it's also an important day for Asian Americans. In March of 1982, John Dingell, who ended up being the longest serving congressman called the Chinese, was a congressman from Michigan. And excuse me for the phone call. But in any case, the auto industry was going through a lot of turmoil at that time. And so what he said, he blamed the problems on the little yellow people, otherwise known as Honda. Several months later, on June 19th, 1982, a gentleman named Vincent Chin was celebrating his bachelor's party before he was about to get married, when Ron Evans and his stepson approached him and says, "You Japanese, you caused us to lose our jobs." They had a fight, and then they chased Vincent Chin for 30 minutes with a truck, and eventually caught up with him, and beat him with a baseball bat. The last words that Vincent Chin said was, "It's not fair." He died 4 days later on June 23rd. Ron Evans and his stepson received the following punishment: a $3,000 fine, 3 years probation, no jail time. The Kung Flu comment is another example of scapegoating, or trying to blame an entire race on something else. And for example, lumping all Asian Americans under one umbrella. We have a very rich and diverse ethnic group. And it's not just that, we also are fearful of the perpetuation of the model minority myth, saying, hey, look, the Asians are successful. How come you're not successful? It is a very dangerous model, very dangerous myth that we have been trying to fight. But unfortunately, some of our own members of our community buy into that because it's so positive sounding, but it is a very dangerous thing. And so that is where we've come from. And I believe that, you know, a lot of this needs to be addressed in the school system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Max. Those are very good points, and a good reminder of history that is repeating itself, even in present day, with scapegoating and stereotyping individuals. Well, let me just say that my name again is Ross Romero, and I also grew up in Salt Lake City, attended Highland High School, the University of Utah, went to the University of Michigan for law school, and have practiced law with Jones Waldo for a number of years, 10 years actually, then went to work for Zions Bank. And in the middle of that, I also served in the Utah legislature. And so the consulting work I do is around government relations work and also diversity and inclusion, having grown up here. I was also the president of the Utah Minority Bar Association, very active in an association of Latino elected and appointed officials at the national level, and currently serve on the board of the Institute for Diversity, Inclusion, and Health Equity. So these recent conversations around how COVID is affecting communities, and particularly the Latino community, is something that I work on a lot. And I have consulted with other organizations and other companies outside the state, but I'm very glad to see the conversation has taken hold here in Utah. And I think that we need as many voices in that conversation for inclusion and equity as we can find. So I've been proud to expand some of my efforts here in Utah, as was mentioned. One of the things, and it speaks to what Max just spoke about, is coalescing as communities of color here in Utah. I was the president of the Utah Minority Bar Association. So we did not have, you know, a Hispanic Bar of Utah and a Native American Bar of Utah. We had the Utah Minority Bar Association. And in fact, that still exists. And we have worked collaboratively across multiple disciplines of Utah's diverse communities. And we think that that's empowerful and impactful. I'll just let you know that, you know, the Latino community in Utah is about 14% of the state population. So one of the things I really try to stress with the clients that I work with are the importance of including diverse communities. And importantly, in that Utah conversation, that the Latino community is part of that, not only as a workforce solution, but as a way to integrate and move people up economically. That whole socioeconomic challenge that exists, that comes from education, it comes from relationships, it comes from political engagement, and that's where I see that public policy overlay. But one of the things that was very collaborative with bar associations across the country was a campaign called Wash the Hate. And it was centered around being supportive of the Asian Bar Association and some of the ridicule and some of the bias that they were experiencing, particularly as it related to COVID-19. And so the campaign effort was to show people washing their hands and asking people to wash that hate away. Recognize that this is a world incident. This is a world a pandemic, and it's irrelevant where it came from, because we're all experiencing it. And to try to, as Max said, make fun of it or to belittle it, and the culture that's associated with any particular group is a problem and is offensive. And so it's important that the Silicon Slopes community knows that we do work together on a lot of different things as communities of color, and we're all working to try to improve the community and to bring workforce into opportunities. So let me just say, particularly as it relates to COVID in Utah, the Latino community, as I mentioned, is 14%, but the Latino community is experiencing a 42% COVID-19 positive rate. And there's some recent articles, actually. The Utah Foundation had one today, and there was an editorial in the Tribune today that talked about how come those rates are so high. Some of it has to do with generations living in a household. Some of it has to do with having to work, because these individuals, our community is sometimes in lower paying jobs. Sometimes it's the fact that they don't have access to some of the health care, or they're not able to have the luxury of working from home. And so we saw, I will say also, again, with this public policy overlay, legislators up in Utah Capitol who recognized different parts of the Utah community that were experiencing higher rates. And I'm proud to say that those legislators of color raised that attention to the state and were able to get some resources. But it still doesn't change the fact that communities of color, and the article today also mentioned the Polynesian community, experiencing significantly higher rates. One of the things that they aren't experiencing, thankfully, are deaths. And that is because in the Latino community, our population is pretty young. And I'd like to talk to the other panelists about this. And one of the things I tell clients I work with is you need to look at where the student population is. There are a number of school districts now around the state, and certainly Salt Lake City School District, which is majority minority. So this population, and I say this opportunity, is on its way. And we have to figure out, as community leaders and as business leaders and as policymakers, how do we maximize the potential that exists in our youth? And so maybe if we could go in reverse order, Max, if you could please speak, talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing in the student population and how we get them to engage, particularly in the STEM efforts, and maybe even the STEAM efforts. I know you mentioned you're a big advocate through the arts, and then we'll ask Samantha and Jeanette the same question.
Well, I want to piggyback, first of all, on your comment about the majority minority in Salt Lake District. My children attend Granite School District. I attended Granite School District. I was a Skyline High graduate. And I've been looking at the numbers. And then probably when I was growing up, it felt like maybe 80-20 of white to non-white. I don't have those exact numbers. But I do know that in 2009, it was 60% white to 40% non-white ratio. And in the 2018-2019 numbers, the 1920 numbers have not come out yet, it is nearly 50.5% to 49.5%. So the majority minority is has reached an equilibrium. But if you look at that, and then you see where the spread of the students are, and also the representation on school boards or the teachers or administrative levels, they are not reflective of persons of color. And so I strongly believe that arts is not a separate silo from STEM. And I know that a lot of tech people think differently, but when you're designing something, for example, you need to have some able way of communicating how to operate it, how to make it user-friendly, all these things. I think that STEAM arts and design should be an integral part. And one of the things we did when we were teaching about the Chinese railroad workers last year to the kids and this is related to history, is that we use art projects to help them understand what would be like to be a Chinese railroad worker. So I taught the lesson to the students, and we worked with, for example, the Beverly Taylor Sorensen Foundation. And they brought in artists to work with the students to create their own graphic novel. And through this graphic novel, they created a perception of what they think should have happened, perhaps, with the Chinese railroad workers, or what could have happened. And as the kids were going through distance learning this year, the fourth graders last year were fifth graders this year, and they were leaving the school because it only goes through fifth grade. And they're talking about their favorite memories of their years at elementary school. Some will say, we're gonna miss recess, we're gonna miss the teachers. But several teachers talked about this, several students talked about their experience of learning about the Chinese railroad workers. And the one student at the very end, she says, what I loved about doing the graphic novel was being able to write a story from someone else's perspective. And I think what we achieved there is that we achieved a sense of empathy with these students. And this was just as one school. And I believe it should be applied across the board. Through arts and humanities, we create better citizens, people who understand, who are more educated, more informed, who have developed critical thinking skills, and have a sense of empathy. And I think this is important for the tech world to know, that the arts and humanities is really what it will bring us back in many ways, where we become human again, where we stop all this hate and wash the hate. So I really strongly encourage these organizations to invest in the arts in the schools and humanities in the schools. So you get more well-rounded leaders in your workforce. And I think that will make a big difference.
Thank you. Samantha?
So visiting schools and speaking with youth and our teachers, what I've found is that we really need to be intentional about doing outreach in these communities because of the historical trauma within our communities and the fear that we have during the boarding school era. We really do not trust anyone outside of our community. So it's really important that we go into these communities, that we work one-on-one with students and teachers. And what students have really enjoyed doing is storytelling, providing them spaces and opportunities to share their stories, to speak with elders in the community who have those stories, the traditions, the knowledge, and are more than willing to pass them down. The University of Utah School of Medicine does a really great job with STEM outreach. They go out to the rural communities. They've been out in Uinta Ouray, Ibapa, San Juan County, and they take these science kits and they do science projects with the students who most likely do not have the opportunity or do not have the funds to be able to go into the larger cities to be able to attend the university. So it's really being intentional about going into the community to provide these resources, and then also providing opportunities for them to develop their own curriculum where, like I said, almost 90% of our history books teaches about our history before the 1900s. So really developing our curriculum so that it is inclusive of our history, as well as providing them, like I said, opportunities, provide curriculum development. What students have also enjoyed is working on social justice issues. So looking at the political landscape and how those decisions that are made in Washington, DC, or at the national, federal level impact them at the local and state level. And this is where Max also mentioned the importance of having representation at the state and local level. We do not have Native representation on our school boards and our city councils. So it's really important to have them there so that they have the knowledge that they are able to uplift some of the issues that we're having. And you know, I give my two daughters an example. I have one in middle school, one in elementary, and we have the Title VI program coordinators who come into the schools and visit with our Native youth, but that's still not enough to bridge the gap with the rest of the student bodies who may have access or opportunities depending on the school that they're attending, depending on the financial resources that they have. So we really need to focus more on where are the gaps, how can we fill those gaps, and also just increasing representation all across the board.
Thank you. Jeanette?
Okay, thank you. I totally agree. We do need to have greater representation on school boards with people of color, because one person on each school board or none at all is not going to be sufficient enough. So we do need to make sure that we can get folks that are willing to serve on these school boards that are, would be good representation. So then the children, our young folks, see that there are people of color that are willing to serve and to take their best interests at heart. So often we see that, especially this last, because of what happened with COVID-19, we have so many of our young people that don't have access to computer, internet, or anything like that. And so we, worked with the Salt Lake Education Foundation, rather, to try to get have hotspots so young people could either have some laptops so they'd be able to do their schoolwork, because they fall behind. And as you know, when they start falling behind, it's the brown and black kids that are the ones that don't complete the high school. And then now we're having that problem even in elementary school, and it's a huge problem. So I think one of the things that Silicon Slopes hopefully would be able to do is to help the schools to be able to have the computers, have the laptops, have the families be able to have access to the internet, because we need to make sure that they're not falling behind, and we need to make sure that perhaps they may want to get involved with things that with the STEM program. So how do they do that? What can Silicon Slopes hopefully do that will make them become more interested in being more involved in something like that? I think there might need to be more, say for instance, roundtable discussions on how do we get our young folks involved with STEM programs, have some job fairs where we can have not only the adults, but the young folks start coming to the job fairs to say, this is what it takes to get to in this field. I think we can go even to some of the community organizations, minority groups, the minority bar, those type of groups, to make sure that we're interacting with everybody to see and to make sure that the knowledge and say for instance, the laptops, the access to the internet is being accessible to all children, not just a few children. And I think we can work together with the teachers as well to make sure that they understand the situation, because when they're trying to do homework, some of them may not, some may realize that these young folks, they don't even have a computer, they can't keep up. And then they continue to start falling behind. And if they're a little kindergarten or first grader, then they start falling behind, and it's just a continual setback for these young people. And then another example might be to try to get some tutors for these young folks and try to make sure that they can understand the importance of, learning how to read or learning how to interact and have access to the computer. So I just think those are some of the things that we might look at, and to be more involved in how Silicon Slopes would be able to connect with the community groups and community organizations.
Thank you, Jeanette. I will recognize that the Silicon Slopes community has seen the value and the importance of engaging in computer science. And so they have been advocating at the Utah legislature to make sure computer science and computer training and computers are available in classrooms around the state. And so that really is to be commended. And, and a recognition that right now, Utah's minority population, well, this was from 2010, is 19%. But by 2060, it's estimated to be 35%. So this importance of making sure we are bringing along the youth, which are increasingly diverse, that they're part of the workforce solutions, that they're part of the economy of Utah, is important to our state's growth. It's important to maximizing these youth, the potential in the youth. And so that's why I spend so much time in this workplace conversation, making sure people understand this demographic and this need to make investment and to be engaged. Let me just give you some other information. By 2025, 75% of the global workforce will be millennials, and they are increasingly acquiring leadership roles. It is important for organizations to recognize that millennials want their employers to be diverse. 80% of millennial generation consider company policies on diversity, equality, and inclusion during their job search. So the workforce that's coming is increasingly more diverse, and they care about social justice. They care about economic opportunities, which is why we're seeing so much of that demonstrated engagement in the streets. And there is a lot of concern about social justice reform, about policing practices. So Jeanette, I know you've been working on some of these issues relative to the protests and modification and changes into police interactions. What would you like to see relative to changes being made at the Utah legislature?
Some of the changes that we have been working on, and maybe not so much change, but making sure that it's implemented, would be the police accountability, the transparency. Of course, we're looking at making sure that we can get a lot of the cities start up their civilian review boards. And we know that all of them won't be able to do that. We're looking at maybe cities with roughly maybe 25,000 or so folks that would be the population that might be able to work with the NAACP and other groups to start up a civilian review board. And I have had some national folks that have seen some of the articles, I guess, and they were offering to help us as well. And they have put together these review boards across the country. And I think that that's one of the really good things that we want to see. I served on the West Valley Review Board much longer than just a short time with the Salt Lake City Review Board. And I do know that the West Valley City officers, they do like it. And so we didn't have any problems with it whatsoever. So I think that would be a plus. Some of the other issues that we were looking at was pushing for more diversity, in their hiring practices, and make sure that we can get more officers of color that are applying, and that we see more of those officers on those forces. And I think we can do that, but we just have to make sure that we can get people that are interested in serving as a police officer to be able to serve in that capacity.
I think that's right. One of the things I saw recently, Jeanette, is an encouragement of there to be more diversity training as officers become officers and understanding the communities they live. And that's going to help, them understand who they're serving. When I was in the legislature, I actually proposed something similar for new members of the legislature to have some training and some background about who it is that makes up Utah, so that we could have that empathy that Max talked about, and understand who we're serving, because sometimes districts are pretty homogeneous, but when you look at the totality of Utah, there's a lot of diversity in it, politically, ethnically, religiously, and so capturing that is important.
It really is.
Let me ask Samantha and Max. One of the things you both mentioned was the importance of the concept, if you can see it, you can be it, right? It's important for the youth to see themselves as teachers and as scientists, as mathematicians. And one of the things that I had personal experiences with, the Latino community sometimes gets stereotyped, right? When they're depicted in movies, they're the gangbangers, or they're the sexy model, or they are the drug runners. And Gina Rodriguez came to an event that I did at the Sundance Film Festival, and it was about changing that conversation. She said, I want to see people like my sister who is a scientist. And she said, I want to be the geeky kid, because I love math and science. And so to Samantha and Max, talk a little bit about how stereotypes reinforce negative images, and what should be done to make sure that the people that are watching this have an opportunity to speak up when things are not right, and to give good examples of doing it well, being an advocate. Maybe Samantha.
Yes, so I think not only, addressing stereotypes, but also providing a counter narrative. So often when we speak about Native American communities, it's about the poverty, the unemployment, of course, the stereotype about alcoholism, but we have plenty of stories about the strength and resilience of our community, especially now with us going through this pandemic. We've had a number of individuals, grassroots organizations who have really stepped in to help take care of our elders, to provide essential supplies. We've had donation drives from different communities to take food, PPE, supplies down, at least for my tribe, the Navajo Nation. So it's been really great to see that solidarity. And then also, so many of our communities work in silos. And we've seen in the past couple of years, our communities working together with the Latinx community, with the Black community. And really some of the same issues that we have in our community are the same issues that are happening in other communities. So it's really just more of how can we work in solidarity? How can we support each other? Even right now, we have our own issues with police brutality, mass incarceration, working on criminal justice reform, but we're really taking a step back and having the Black Lives Movement, Black Lives Matter take the lead, and really following them and asking, well, how can we support? What can we do to help you in making some of these initiatives and changes? Because ultimately those changes are going to impact all of us in a positive way. So I think more sharing of the positive stories that have been going on. And then also, again, just going back to education, making sure that we have someone sitting at the table to call out if, something's not right. And if we are at the table and if we don't see someone there, and we're not just talking about race and ethnicity, we're also talking about women too, that we make sure that those voices are included, and that going back again to, I keep going to data because it's really important that we disaggregate that data, that we're making sure that we're seeing the numbers and how the numbers are impacting our community, and how those numbers, for example, make a huge impact with the census. With the pandemic going on, I'm really concerned that we're not going to have an accurate census count, when it's really critical that those numbers get counted so that we have the funds to be able to improve our communities as far as economic development, improving technology, infrastructure, and those resources are going to the communities that need them most. And again, just amplifying voices. And yeah, I don't know what else to add. I know that Max has something great to add, so I'm going to leave some time for him.
Thank you, Samantha. I didn't mention this earlier, but I did attend UC Berkeley, and I majored in political science, but I actually took a lot of classes in Asian American studies and ethnic studies. And UC Berkeley was the first university to have both Asian American studies and ethnic studies. And now it's called the Asian American Asia Diaspora Studies. And I recently went back for a reunion to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the establishing of the department. And one of my classmates, a really good friend of mine, with that back in the day, we were activists at Berkeley for Asian American issues, is a Viet Nguyen, who won a Pulitzer Prize for his book, The Sympathizer. And he came to Utah a couple years ago at the invitation of Paisley Rachdahl, who is Asian American Studies professor at the University of Utah, as well as our current poet laureate. And as he was talking there, he said, "What do we do? What do we need to do?" And he says, "We've been trained our whole life to do this." And that's what all of a sudden inspired me, that we've been trained this whole life to do representation and to fight this myth of the model minority, of where we're good at math. I mean, this is kind of a funny story, but actually it's kind of a silly story. When I had left the Granite School District for a couple of years. I went to Roland Hall for 2 years, and I went back for 7th grade. And I automatically, everyone had to get tested, but I automatically got into the gifted math program without even being tested. It was good for me. I was probably qualified, but those are things that are really dangerous because not everyone is good at math. And not everyone is smart. Not everyone comes from an academic family. Some came as refugees. Some are coming in as part of the sex slave trade. Some are coming in for other reasons. We have diversity. And without having an understanding of a multitude, that we don't have role models that are also artists, social workers, athletes, actors in the arts, not just science, math, doctor. You need to be a lawyer, doctor, or something like that. We had to get beyond that mindset. Even Andrew Yang's presidential campaign, as much as I wanted to support him on many things, I did support him on many things, I would cringe when he would use math, make America think harder, and other typical Asian American stereotypes. And going back to my friend Viet, he talked about narrative plentitude. And it's where the stories right now, when Crazy Rich Asians came out a couple years ago, we were all begging it would be a good movie. Please be a good movie, because if it's a bad movie, it just ruins it for all of us. Because we don't have that economies of scale, the scale of, oh, we can have a good movie and a bad movie, and that's it. But a good movie represents all of us, and a bad movie represents all of us. And that's why I strongly feel that representation in all levels is important. Let's go back to the schools, teachers, administrators, leadership position, board members. Because if you don't have members of color, people of color in that area, no one aspires to be anything beyond that. And they don't have places to look towards. And it's dangerous. They feel their voices are silent. And eventually, are we talking about Alexis Tocqueville's, the tyranny of the majority? And we're not looking at the whole holistic group, because we are in this together. We built this country together. And I always feel that the greatness of America is never behind us, it's always ahead of us. And whether we all agree where we are at this moment, we all have to believe that our greatness is ahead of us. And so we do need representation. As a board member for Salt Lake County, I was on the Salt Lake County ZAP board, Tier 1. I was on the Center for the Arts, now the Arts and Culture, as well as cultural facilities. And we try to promote diversity, but every time people say, well, do you have a list for us for board members? No, it's not us to give you a list just because someone's race, or they would ask me, hey, Max, would you be on our board? And half the time it says, am I just gonna be a token? Am I going to just have to be the face of the race? And that's a lot of pressure for a lot of people. And so we need to diversify that. Companies in Silicon Slopes, whether our boards, school boards, or nonprofit boards, it is your responsibility to go out and diversify to represent the population. It's not for us to come and give you a list. So that is what I would strongly encourage about how we can move forward in this conversation.
Thank you, Max. I think that's a wonderful call to action for the Silicon Slopes community that, importantly is giving us this venue, giving us this opportunity to share how to improve our community. And I appreciate that. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't recognize the challenges and the intersection that Samantha mentioned between women and communities of color. There is still disparity between women in tech and the opportunities they experience. And I'll just ask this community to think about the additional challenges of the intersection of being a woman of color, and how few and how very few instances there are of reaching out to individuals that represent that community, and how do we pull them in and how do we bring them along. I'll also just say,
sorry, and I think one thing I forgot to mention, I think the intersection of what Samantha brought up is also our members of the people of color and who are members of the LGBTQ community. And that's something that we should also take into account.
That's very true. Very true. That, again, that it goes to that diversity of community that is so rich here. And in fact, Salt Lake City gets recognized for being a particularly LGBTQ friendly community. And many of us are happy to be part of that, living in the Salt Lake City with all of that rich diversity. And I think it's also important to recognize, because, these are businesses. And sometimes I think the conversation is, well, if we do that, it comes at a cost of something else. And it's important to recognize that from a global CEO survey indicates 85% of companies who have a formal diversity and inclusion strategy report report improvements to the bottom line. So you don't compromise your opportunities. You in fact enhance your opportunities, whether it be with reaching new customers or getting new ideas or being more collaborative or having your employees speak to different communities to be an advocate back to the community. And that's why this workplace dynamic and inclusion at all levels, right? Sometimes I will also say the initiative starts at the bottom. Well, let's bring people in as interns and let them work themselves up. The challenge is if we're constantly bringing folks in at the internship level and they never rise to mid-level or C-suite leaders, and they're not nurtured to become those leaders, we're always perpetuating this entry level engagement, and we have got to do better. The community demands it, and the talent exists, so we've got to integrate them. The other thing I'll say, and we only have about 10 minutes left, I think. There's so many questions I have, but let's just settle on this question. Silicon Slopes, as I mentioned, is giving us an opportunity to provide recommendations for solutions. How is it that we can amplify this moment so that there can be positive long-term change in the companies that make up Silicon Slopes and in our community at large? What do you want to see happen now that we have a lot of attention and a lot of engagement and a desire to make change? Maybe Jeanette, if we can have you speak to this, and then Samantha and Max, but what is it that we need to really move the needle beyond this immediate moment, so that when we look back in 10, 15 years, we say, man, there was a catalyst of change and look what we've accomplished?
I think one of the very important issues that should be addressed, and hopefully that we can do, is to form a group, and it doesn't have to be called a coalition, but have Silicon Slopes come into our different communities to talk to a group of folks that are really interested in making sure that we can, of course, start talking to our young people first, get them, have them become interested in some of the tech, the tech schools, the STEM programs. I think that it would be good to do. Look at some of the different ways that we can have maybe some short videos for the young folks to have them become more interested in it. Maybe set up some type of a community workshop where they can go and look at ways that they can become involved. That means the Silicon Slopes as well as some of the other folks. And then working with the, not necessarily the school boards, but some of the teachers in the different schools, whatever grade that they want to start at. If they want to start at 4th grade, 5th grade, that would be good. Or if they want to start at the, say for instance, Education Foundation, to see how they can reach the folks within the community for greater outreach. I just think, some of those outreach opportunities would be great.
Very good. Samantha?
Yeah, so along with Jeanette, providing more outreach opportunities, really going into our communities without making those assumptions about what we want or what we need. So having those conversations about what our issues are and where Silicon Slopes can come in and help support, and really engaging our Native youth at an earlier and younger age. So really talking about what those opportunities are and what they mean for Native youth. And this does not include just talking to them about what job opportunities there may be, but also providing them with scholarships so that they're not stuck in student loan debt when they are finished with higher education. And also want to make note that not everyone has the same path. We all have different paths into higher education, and looking at other opportunities outside of higher education. What can our applied tech schools do to support Native youth getting into the field? And I think also one of the biggest things that Silicon Slopes can help with is providing us with the tools to succeed. And one of those biggest things is bridging the digital divide. When we transitioned over to e-learning down in San Juan County, Utah, 30% of our Native students didn't have access to the internet to be able to complete their homework and e-learning assignments. So how can Silicon Slopes help support our Native communities by providing broadband services and high-speed internet? I think that's one big area. And then also transitioning into the future of energy efficient opportunities, solar energy, things like that. So where we can get more of our tribes and Native folks involved.
Very good. Thank you. Max?
This may be repeating a little bit what I've said, but I'd like to challenge the Silicon Slopes community to invest in 2 areas. The first is in education, starting with the public schools, and that we have really a comprehensive, what you want to call it, diversity, equity, inclusion, or ethnic studies, or so forth, but to expand and make sure that stories of all the people, especially let's take, for example, Utah history, that all the peoples who have contributed to this great state are included. And then some of the bad things, the things that we've done, until we come to grips with our past and do some introspection, we can really never go forward. So let them encourage the schools with your great resources to invest in ethnic studies and a diverse history in the schools. The second area is still within the arts, whether it's in the schools or with other ways, to help tell the stories. Last year, as part of the 150th anniversary, I was co-producer of a musical called Gold Mountain, which talked about the Chinese railroad workers and their building through the Sierra, building a tunnel through the Sierra Mountains, the hardest surface in North America, and all the tragedies that came with it. I have a good friend from high school. She's just written a Broadway musical about Harriet Tubman entitled Harriet. It was supposed to go on in Salt Lake Community College, I believe, this year, but because of COVID, it got delayed. Instead of investing in those big, great, let's say Disney-fied theaters, who are great, they're still important. They bring stories, they do bring entertainment, but invest in those communities to help tell their stories through the arts and humanities. I guarantee you that ultimately, those who are going into your industry will be better rounded, will have better critical thinking skills, and will be better representations for your companies.
Thank you. Thank you, Max. I wrote down some great ideas. I think, you know, the Silicon Slopes community really has a unique place to play relative to inviting people, particularly the youth, Utah's diverse youth, into this conversation through YouTube engagement. I thought that was very, very helpful, Jeanette. And also, as Samantha said and Max said, come to us. It's important that you reach out to diverse communities and to be part of our space. And don't always just expect us to find you. Because if you make the time and effort to visit us in our homes and in our communities and in our organizations, you will find us willing to share information and resources. And I haven't seen our moderator or our coordinator, I should say, from Silicon Slopes tell me we're off. So let me ask you another question, but we will be brief. If you could just name an organization that you work with that you think is particularly impactful into Utah's diverse communities, what is the name of that organization and what do they do quickly? Because part of this is to make sure we're providing resources about who else is doing work here and where are the resources. So maybe Max, if you wouldn't mind sharing an organization and its community value, and then Samantha and Jeanette.
Sure.
Really quickly, I think OCA of Utah, originally is known as the Organization of Chinese Americans, but that now they have included a larger umbrella of Asian Americans. I think they do a lot of great advocacy work.
Thank you. Samantha?
The Urban Indian Center of Salt Lake City is a great place to go. They can connect you with not only urban natives and rural natives with activities and resources in the community. They're also a great resource for non-natives to learn more about what is going on with the native community and how partnerships can form as far as city statewide.
And one of the areas that we work with NAACP and some of my other folks is the Salt Lake Education Foundation, because they go out and they help the students, making sure that they have food when school is not in session, making sure that they have access to computers, access to the internet, and those type of things. And this is not just for, when school's not in session, but then throughout as well, because a lot of times we find that some of our young people of color, they don't have access to even food. So the Education Foundation, we make sure that the families have food as well throughout the year. So those are some of the things that we do working with the Salt Lake Education Foundation.
Jeanette, thank you for that reminder. Food insecurity, particularly during the summer months when kids are out of school, and that's oftentimes when they're getting their nutrition, it's a challenge and it's important to be mindful of. And the Utah Food Bank is a good place, and the foundations of our districts is another place where that food insecurity can be addressed. Finally, I'll just say the organization that I have worked with and find particularly inspiring is Latinos in Action. It helps kids in junior high and high school become student leaders and be college and workforce ready. A tremendous asset. And I know that there's collaborations going on there in the job communities. Well, thank you to the other panelists, Jeanette Williams, Samantha Eldridge, and Max Chang. Really appreciate your willingness to share your information. Thanks again to Silicon Slopes and the participants on this social media outreach today. Thank you for the opportunity to have this engagement, and we look forward to more opportunities to interact. So thank you again to the panelists.
Thank you.